All right, Andrew, you good to go?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Well, welcome to our November luncheon technical event type thing that we're starting to get used to, all of us here. As with most professional societies, we're kind of moving into the virtual world. We did our district meeting a few months back, and now we're starting to get into these luncheon technical events, which we'll probably be moving forward with our annual banquet that's going to be coming up after the new year. So be on the lookout for that when it's coming. We'll have more information on how it's going to be, what's going to be part of it, speakers, awards, that type of thing. I'm really actually thrilled to have had part of this. We worked together in Aurora on some bike things, and with the pandemic, I've seen bike usage go up in the Aurora area at least. So I'm hoping that we can use a lot of this information for future project considerations. With that, I'm going to hand it off to Andrew here, who's going to kind of run through how this event's going to go as the technical director.
Thanks, Josh. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Andrew Freeman, and I'm the current technical director for the Illinois section of ITE. Just want to go through a few kind of housekeeping things before we get started. If you have any questions for our presenter today, please use the Q&A functionality that's built into Zoom. That'll allow you to see other questions people have asked, as well as thumbs up questions you find particularly interesting. And then we'll try and get to those at the end of the presentation as time allows. If you're having any sort of technical issues or need to get in contact with us, the best way would be to use the chat over on your right side, which I'll be monitoring, and try and help you resolve any sort of issue you're having. If you or anyone you know has any ideas or topics or projects you want to share about, and you'd be interested in giving a webinar like this in the future, please contact me. You can reach me at the Illinois ITE plus technical @gmail.com account. And then regarding PDHs, I'll have those sent out to everybody probably around within a week. If you do have any issue with that, and go ahead and contact me, and I'll look into it and get it figured out for you. So with all that being said, thank you everyone for being here. And of course, thank you to our presenter today, Ed Barsotti. Ed has been with the Ride Illinois since 2001. His work with the statewide advocacy organization has focused on improving bicycling conditions through infrastructure, education of cyclists and motorists, and more. In this role, Ed has served as bike planning consultant for 21 Illinois towns and advisor for dozens of others. He has provided bicycle accommodation input for hundreds of road projects and serves on IDOT's Bureau of Local Roads and Streets Manual Committee. So with that being said, I hand it off to Ed and let him present.
All right, thanks very much, Andrew, and thanks, Josh. Good afternoon, everyone. See if I can get the screen shared. Okay. And how does that look for everyone? Are we okay?
Yep, looks fine on our end.
All right, well, thanks for the introduction. Again, my name is Ed Barsotti. Ride Illinois is a nonprofit organization that is involved in trying to improve biking conditions in many different ways. I'm going to be focusing on the infrastructure side of it today. I do want to point out to those in attendance, and I recognize some names from being with cities and being with consultants, is that we can serve as a resource. That's one of our roles, is to be a resource on issues, whether it's looking at what might be the appropriate bikeway in the situation, or how to best accommodate bikes given certain conditions. So we can be a resource for you, and feel free to contact us after this webinar with your project questions. As was mentioned by Andrew, we've been involved in many different towns helping out as a consultant, and we have provided a whole lot of input on road projects, especially for IDOT. So the topics that I'm going to talk about today, and in roughly about a 50-minute give or take. First of all, a little bit of an introduction, motivation on why we want to plan for bicycling in our road projects and in our communities, where different types of people bike. Secondly, I'll look at the main manuals and standards that are out there when you're dealing with the subject of bike accommodation. Third is the main part of the presentation, where I'll go through kind of a menu of options for both off-road types of bikeways as well as different on-road things that you can do. And then finally, fourth is kind of a hodgepodge of different strategies and tips that we've picked up over the years, both on the accommodation of bikeways as well as securing grants. So why do we plan for bicycles? In the towns that I've served as a consultant especially, I've seen that there's a strong latent demand from the community, not just for a trail in town, one designated place, but they're looking for a town where they can get around by bike, either by choice or out of necessity. So making your town more bike friendly, your roads more bike friendly, is something that I found has been very popular. Bicyclists are often referred to as an indicator species for the quality of life in a community. And if you ever look at the backgrounds of TV ads and so on, you'll often see a bike going by to kind of convey that. Economic development, we've seen that especially professional millennials, the entrepreneur class, are looking for different transportation options to get around rather than just drive everywhere. Bicycling is certainly a part of that, and we've even heard stories where a major employer in a suburban location left and went to a more transportation option friendly location because of that community not having options for bicycling. And the very next day I heard from that Chamber of Commerce of the town on how to become more bike friendly. Health benefits, bicycling is a moderate form of physical activity. It's a way to fit in physical activity into our busy lives if we're able to at least divert some of our car trips to bicycle. And environmental, when we start our cars, the catalytic converters take a while to warm up. So the first couple of miles of driving tend to be disproportionate polluters affecting our clean air. So there's several reasons why a community might look at bicycling. The different uses of bicycling, the one that most people think of is bicycling as recreation and fitness, and that's certainly a major component. But another major component that often is overlooked is transportation, and that consists of two components. One is the transportation choice that I talked about briefly already, but also transportation necessity. And what I mean by that is people who either can't afford to drive or maybe they have some condition that they aren't able to drive. Providing for the safety of those people is very important. It's really an obligation for communities to improve the safety for these individuals. And very often their jobs are along the busiest roads at some of the restaurants or lower income jobs that are along busy roads in our commercial areas of town. So our road projects really do become important, even in towns that might have a great trail along the river. Different people ride different places depending on age and abilities and traffic tolerance. Generally in bike planning, sidewalks are considered fine as where you should plan for younger kids. They don't yet have the physical or the mental capabilities yet to share the road with traffic. So generally, if you're looking at an on-road bikeway, and we'll get to that, it usually is a good practice to make sure that that roadway also has sidewalks for kids that may be on that route. This is probably the largest percentage of adults. We call them occasional or casual adult bicyclists. And their traffic tolerance is not super high. Quieter residential streets, dedicated trails, striped off bike lanes that might be even separated or buffered. These are the types of facilities that this audience is looking for. And if you're going to do a community bike plan, the casual adult cyclist tends to be a good target audience. Experienced cyclists, these are the people that will have a pair of spandex in the drawer, and they're often club level riders. They're more traffic tolerant. They do ride the most miles, so they tend to prefer more direct routes. They don't want to necessarily take a circuitous route to get to where they're going. And we should generally try to have it so that roads are bikeable at least for this level of cyclist. If we're outside of towns in rural areas, for example, the chances are that you're not going to see as many casual cyclists there. Casual cyclists generally won't bike as much distance. Once you get outside of towns, the proportion that are in this category of experienced cyclists tends to increase. And then finally, teens and the poor, people who have to use their bicycle for transportation. Different characteristics there. Many times they're riding at night to their jobs or coming back from their jobs, and they may not have lights. Often they'll ride against the traffic flow on a roadway, thinking that that's always safest, which we'll get to in a bit. They're looking for access to destinations, such as along those busy roads in town. And unfortunately, they tend to be disproportionately represented in the bicyclist fatalities that we have. All right, so I'm going to take a quick look here at the different manuals, and I'm sure that many of you are familiar with at least a few of these. The one that's considered really the Bible of bike planning and bike accommodation is the Asto Bike Guide. This is from the state DOTs, and while it's officially guidance, because it is accepted in the courts as the so-called standard, people tend to follow this very closely. It's been the long-time industry reference that people use. Unfortunately, it does tend to be kind of slow-moving. The last version was in 2012. We've had a lot of different evolutionary treatments that have occurred with biking in that time. So the 2012 version is kind of out of date. The next edition is supposed to be soon. We'll see if that is the case. One that you may have heard of as well is the Naktil Urban Bikeway Design Guide. This one you can find online for free. The Asto Guide you have to purchase. This is one where the large cities where a lot of the new developments in biking accommodations have been occurring, they got impatient with Asto. So they have done their own experimentation, their own trials, and they've banded together to create this document, which now has official sign-off by the Federal Highway Administration. It's also mentioned in IDOT's manual as well, and we'll get to that. What I like about this manual, besides some of the newer treatments, is that the diagrams that are in there and the guidance that are in there are really nice, really good details. So I find it to be very user-friendly, even on treatments that are in the Asto Guide as well. Everyone knows about this one, the MUTCD. Like the Asto Guide, it is pretty out of date, the last official version being 2009. The next one is quite delayed. These are regulations, you have to follow these. The good news on the MUTCD is that there is a web page that shows the most recent developments on the bicycle accommodation front. So there you'll see things such as green paint, different route signs, different things that are disallowed, things that are allowed through interim approval, things which the FHWA has set up for experimentation. So I recommend this as a place to look if the treatment that you're considering is not yet in the MUTCD's published version. And then another one that the FHWA came out with in the last year or so is their Bikeway Selection Guide. That had been somewhat of a criticism for some of the other manuals, is that you didn't have charts like this. Volume versus speed, what is the appropriate treatment? This tries to fill that gap. As you can see, there's not solid lines separating what you should do where. It's somewhat blurred, but it is very helpful in making those decisions. You'll see things such as paved shoulder width that varies according to speed and volume. You'll see intersection performance by different bikeway types. What are the issues that come up? And you'll also see some real life examples where maybe the ideal treatment is not possible. What are the different trade-offs for going with some backup solutions? So that's something that we often see in bike planning, where you cannot achieve the ideal, but you have to deal with what are the different trade-offs and settle for something lower. This particular manual does a pretty good job with a couple of case studies on that. And then finally, IDOT's manuals, where you have the BDE for IDOT's state roads and the Bureau of Local Roads and Streets. Now, one thing about this is because IDOT had been really short-staffed on a number of fronts, these manuals for years have been way behind the national guidance. But the good news is that both of these manuals are catching up. The BDE had a major revision of their bike chapter last year, and the BLRS is going to have some changes fairly soon. So many different towns have seen that because the BLRS has been behind, that their treatments have not been approved by IDOT and they've run into some problems. I would suggest in that case that take a look at some of the other manuals that we've talked about and look for, what is the current best practice nationally? Is it something that's in another manual? Show that to IDOT and you might be able to get your approval. All right, at this point, we'll move on to the different types of off-road and on-road bikeways. Looks like we're on schedule. So some thoughts on this section is that bikeway choices really are rapidly evolving. There's been a lot that's gone on the last 10, 15 years in this field, driven especially by the larger cities. Whatever your different context is, whether you're looking at a rural, suburban, or urban location, one size does not fit all for bikeway choice. We'll take a look at what's appropriate where. Another thought is, people think a lot about bicycling. They think about separate trails, Fox River Trail, the Lakefront Trail in Chicago, and so on. Those things get a lot of attention, but the issue of bike-friendly road designs don't get as much attention by elected officials or staff and communities. That hopefully will change here in the future, and we'll take a look at how to make some of those road designs more bike-friendly. And then be aware of the different backups to the ideal. We mentioned this with the FHWA guide that just came out. There's different issues that are out there that we'll touch on. Political issues, some cost issues, and just real life situations that may prevent you from implementing the ideal. And we'll try to touch on these as we talk about the different types. So the first one, the most popular type of bikeway is the off-road trail on its own right-of-way. Whether it's an old railroad corridor or along a river or whatever the case may be, these often are the backbone for a community's bikeway network. For example, when I've done bike plans in the Fox River Valley, a major goal that the town conveyed was, let's have it so all the Fox River Trail users can go out and explore our town and patronize our businesses. So how do we build a network that connects to the trail? Similarly, how do we get our residents better access to the trail? So it really can become a backbone if you do have one of these in your community. I do want to mention too that what you'll see is that trails are heavily advertised in new home developments, new subdivisions. They advertise trails as a big amenity, but if you try to retrofit a trail somewhere, you're going to get people freaking out, listing the common NIMBY fears. It's going to hurt our property values, it's going to increase crime, and so on. These are just myths, and towns are often ill-prepared to handle those concerns that inevitably will come up. So I would suggest that if you're working on a trail project for a town, that you take a look at Rails to Trails Conservancy. They have research that debunks those fears. A special type of trail along a roadway in the roadway's right-of-way is called a side path or a multi-use trail or other names. I call them side paths. These are basically like widened sidewalks, 10 foot wide. You have to have a 5 foot buffer or barrier. I would suggest that in the dense urban cores, that side paths are not the best treatment because you have very many crossings from side streets, commercial entrances, residential driveways, and so on. Side paths function best when you don't have many crossings. And places with good access control, such as your busier and faster roads, are places where you don't have that many crossings. So we often will see side paths, especially along those busier, faster roads. They tend to be more appropriate there. And if we design the intersections well, the inherent concerns that we'll look at in the next couple of slides can be alleviated. A common perception that people have is that let's always get bicyclists off the roadway. It's always safer off the roadway. But it turns out that in places where the sidewalk or the side path has a lot of crossings, a lot of those entrances, driveways, and so on, that the crash rates actually show a higher rate of car-bike crashes from off-road. And it's all about what happens at intersections, obviously, what motorists are expecting, where they're looking when they make different turns. So for example, take a look at both of the cars in this picture. And we have pictures of the view angle of where they look when they make the different turns. The car that's making the right turn, if the turning radius of that intersection is too large, the stop line may be really far back, the crosswalk may be really far back, and the stop line compliance by the driver may be pretty low. That has been the trend. We've seen more and more large turning radii when we design roadways, more stop lines that are farther back, without paying any attention at all to what happens with stop line compliance. And stop line compliance is a major concern if you have a cyclist, such as number 2 in this picture, going against the flow of adjacent traffic, contraflow cyclist, who is not where the driver is looking when that person's about to make their right turn. So that cyclist has to be extremely defensive. And in fact, when I did a Buffalo Grove bike plan, talked to the cops, and there was 39 car bike crashes in a 2-year period, 35 of them were from intersection dynamics such as this. So whether you have the car that's turning right or the car that's turning left, waiting for a gap in the traffic, maybe not seeing cyclist 1 or 2, you run into problems at intersections. So what can be done at intersections to try to alleviate that? If there is enough setback, then I would suggest that a good thing to use is a right corner island. Again, if you have the land to do it, it's a great way to bring the stop lines closer to where it's a realistic place to stop. It brings the crosswalks closer. It also isolates the turning conflicts that the cyclist or the pedestrian using the crosswalk will face. And there also might be operational issues as well, such as breaking up the crossing into smaller pieces. The green light cycle can be less in some cases. So there are many advantages to this. I know that there have been complaints regarding snowplows and problems with that, but this does have a very significant effect on the safety of bicyclists, especially that are using side paths. So if you have the room to do that, please consider it. IDOT's manuals have different sections that kind of conflict with each other. The bike chapter will say that right corner islands are a good thing, but in other places of the manual, it tends to be more discouraged. Take a look at the bike chapter, see what it says, see what the reasons are, and maybe use that as justification for bringing these in. The last slide regarding off-road facilities, this is just kind of a random set of problems that are out there that we see. Upper left here, you'll see what's called a goat path or a desire line. This is clearly a roadway that could benefit from having at least a sidewalk for non-motorized users. Upper right is something that we're seeing more and more as developers develop different parcels, and the developers are the ones putting in the sidewalk. Often we'll see cases where the sidewalks just are not connecting. So if the roadway is really bad to bike on, at least we have to make the off-road facilities connect. Lower left is a case where many times the sidewalk is built at the edge of right-of-way. And if the right-of-way is very large, and if the road is not going to be expanded to 4 lanes anytime soon, what you end up having are very far back crosswalks and stop lines that are just completely ignored and unrealistic. So the rule of thumb about having a sidewalk at the edge of right-of-way, think about that a little bit more if you have a large right-of-way. You don't want to have those crossings too far back. And then lower right, on the, I guess the top part of the road, you'll see a gray a side path that the arrows are pointing to. Very often side paths are built considering only the endpoints instead of all the destinations that are in between. For example, we have a residential side street on the left where there's not that connection to the side path from the other side of the road. And then further on to the right, we see there's a commercial development, a Home Depot in this case, where the side path does not have that connection. So keep in mind that your side path is meant to serve destinations throughout, not just the endpoints. We'll move on now to on-road bikeways. 128, I think we're doing okay. So the topic of on-road bikeways is, it can be very subjective. Whether you're elected officials or the public at large or your staff, people may have different personal experiences of how comfortable they feel on different roadways as a function of the traffic, as a function of the geometry, and so on. So it's important that this very subjective field of how bike-friendly a road is has some objectivity built into it, brought into the process of planning what to do. There are a couple of different measures out there. One that's been around since 1995 is called bicycle level service. It was recently added to the Highway Capacity Manual a few years ago, so it is official. And it is a measure, a quantification of how bike-friendly a road is for a broad range of casual adult cyclists and teens as a function of its roadway geometry, mid-block, and the traffic conditions. So a bunch of different factors in that. This is a calculator that I put together maybe 20 years ago to calculate for any particular road how bike-friendly it is using BLOS. And what we found is that a C or a better grade is a good target if you're trying to accommodate the advanced, the more traffic tolerant cyclist. But if you're doing a bike plan, you're trying to accommodate the more casual cyclist as well, then B is a good target for that. One observation on BLOS is that striping, the act of either striping shoulders or striping a bike lane, tends to improve the condition by 1 grade. So the first of many different bikeway types we'll talk about are bike routes. Bike routes are simply designated through a sign that says bike route, or lower left, a different style of sign that's more wayfinding based. Either one of them is fine as of the 2009 METCD, and really the industry trend has been more to incorporating wayfinding into these bike route signs, instead of just using the old D11-1 that you see in the upper left that says bike route. Well, where does it go? The sign itself does not add to comfort level, but it is a flexible sign that can be used for your entire bike network so you know where you're going. The bike route sign does not have with it a specified geometry, unlike what the Bureau of Local Roads and Streets manual has said about shared lanes. You do not have to have a 14-foot lane width to use these. That's going to be changing really soon, as the VLRS update should be coming out very soon. So this is a flexible use. You can use it on roads that have stripes or don't have stripes. You can use it on narrower roads. All it means is that this is a preferred route for some reason. Next up is bike lanes, and these have been around for quite a while. The traditional bike lanes are the ones that you see in this picture, typically 5 feet or more. They work well, especially when you have lower speed roads that are collector level, even arterials. Residential streets may not need bike lanes. They may be fine with signage alone. Bike lanes do attract a broader range of cyclists because they feel more comfortable with that dedicated space. It does increase BLOS score by about a grade, and it also helps in getting cyclists to bike on the correct side of the road, on the right side of the road with traffic, where they are more visible at intersections, less likely to get into a crash. Bike lanes can also be used if you have a very wide road to do passive traffic calming. So in fact, another case from Buffalo Grove, striping of wide residential roads was something that the police department advocated because it cut down on speeding by 1 to 2 miles an hour in their before and after studies. And it especially cut down on the higher end speeding because of just, again, the passive traffic calming, the friction of having a visually narrower lane. One way to implement bike lanes is through what's called a road diet, where maybe you have a 4-lane road that is not as busy, and maybe you're able to bring it down to 1 through lane in each direction. Having that center left turn lane does help in reducing crashes from getting hit from behind when you're waiting to turn left. And maybe there is enough room left over after you've done that to put in bike lanes on each side of the road. So the 4 to 3 road diet is something that the FHWA has talked about along with other road diets in a guide that they have about road diets. And what we've seen through the FHWA and from best practice is that if you have a roadway with a 10 to 15,000 ADT, depending on what your intersection studies show you on the throughput at intersections, you might be able to do a road diet like this. Another way to implement bike lanes, this is an example from Carbondale on, I think it's US 51, if I recall, where you have lanes that are wider than they might need to be. Wide lanes do encourage faster travel as well. So you might have the real estate, you might have the asphalt width to retrofit bike lanes the next time you resurface. That's what happened in this case. And it's a fairly inexpensive way to implement bike lanes. So a good strategy is take a look at the CIP, look at the MYP, see what road projects are coming up, and take a look, is this an opportunity where we can add some bike lanes that would serve different purposes? Makes it better for cyclists, slow down traffic in certain areas of town. So buffered bike lanes is another type of bike lane that might be implemented. Again, if you have enough extra asphalt width. And the buffers can be either on the parking side or the driving side, the traffic side, depending on factors such as how much parking there is, the rate of turnover of the parking. Where do you need the most protection? If you have the room for both of them, that's great. Depending on how wide apart the buffers are, you may need to put the cross hatches in that you see here. I believe 3 foot or higher is what's recommended by Naktil, at least, for the width that is needed to put in those hatches. A treatment that's gotten a lot of attention probably the last dozen years or so that we see, especially in the dense urban cores of the larger cities, are called separated bike lanes. They've probably had actually 3 or 4 different names over the years already. Cycle tracks is another one. But the idea here is that many cyclists will feel much more comfortable having some sort of physical separation from traffic. In this case, with separated bike lanes, you have this dedicated space that is used only by bikes. You have a sidewalk adjacent to it that is used by pedestrians, but this is dedicated bike space. The physical separation might come from a raised median. It might come from parked cars being on the side, as you see in the center picture, or it could be some other treatments as well. And all of these serve to separate traffic, but intersection dynamics are really a key here, especially if you have a two-way separated bike lanes. Motorists may not be looking in the direction that bike traffic will be coming from. So the Naktil guide in particular is very good at talking about the intersection treatments that need to be done. City of Chicago has done some great stuff, including bicycle-only signals and signal phasing to prevent some of the issues of visibility. And the FHWA actually has a separated bike lane guide as well. So all of these are treatments that can be used to reduce the inherent problems at intersections of these facilities, which are otherwise very, very popular and safe. I will mention with separated bike lanes is that in some of the more suburban locations where perhaps drivers are not accustomed to stopping at the stop line, they're not accustomed to looking both ways at the crosswalk for any sort of pedestrian usage. In those places, perhaps separated bike lanes may run into some more problems. The intersection problems may be harder to solve. So I think that as this treatment gets more use over the years, we'll get a clear definition of where it's best to use these. Dense urban cores, suburban locations, maybe, we'll find out. And if you are in a suburban location, you might decide anyway that the amount of usage doesn't justify having separated bike lanes and sidewalks. A side path might do the job for both types as well. All right, shared lane markings, also called sharrows. These are often a fallback position where you don't have enough room for bike lanes. They tend to be more effective than just signage by itself. And they have a couple of different functions. They tell cars that this is a lane that you may expect to see a heavier amount of use by cyclists. It also tells cyclists when there is parked cars where you should ride to avoid parked cars' doors opening up into their paths. A really nasty crash that's called dooring. This is one that's not official. I call it combined bike parking lane. I even did not capitalize it because it's not official. But the idea here is that maybe you have these wide residential collector roads in a suburban location. And maybe it's a road where, because of the wide lanes, people are speeding on it. There's not much parking. The only time that there's a lot of parking is maybe when someone has a party at their house. But you cannot politically remove parking from one or both sides of the road without getting people upset. So there tends to be conflicting interest here. Often you'll see slow down, drive 25, save our kids. A backup treatment, if you cannot install bike lanes politically here, if you can't remove parking to install bike lanes, a backup treatment might simply be to add stripes to make what essentially are like urban paved shoulders. It's a shoulder space that people parking their cars will feel more secure parking their cars there. People who are biking will probably opt to ride in that so-called shoulder space until they have to go around a car. And people who are driving will see a narrower lane and they'll slow down a little bit more. Now this method only works for cyclists if you have very low parking occupancy and moderate to low traffic counts. We've tried it in a few different towns and the results generally have been pretty good. I know in Geneva, there was a bike plan implementation where the city was going to widen the 5-foot sidewalk into a 10-foot side path. And they had 100 people come out who were freaking out about their front yard landscaping being cut down. So as a backup to that, the city went to this treatment and it seems to have served the different purposes. It has slowed down traffic on the roads as well. Regular paved shoulders on uncurbed roads are for very significant rural roads. The amount of width that you need to accommodate bikes tends to vary according to the traffic level and if you have a lot of truck traffic. Shoulders do have advantages for run-off the road crashes as well as road maintenance in addition to being a place for bikes. They do need sweeping like bike lanes, otherwise debris will collect and make it somewhat unusable for bikes. A trend that has been happening a lot lately nationally through IDOT HSIP funding is to add rumble strips along shoulders. Maybe it's projects that add both rumble strips and the shoulders at the same time. And what often happens on those projects is that there is not enough clear zone to the right of the rumbles for people to bike. And that's a major problem for biking because cyclists are unable to ride on rumble strips. If there's not enough clear zone to ride on the shoulder, they'll have to ride on the lane itself. And that'll confuse or irritate a lot of drivers who believe the bike should be on the shoulder. So our contention is that such a design is less safe for bicyclists than not having any shoulders at all. So if you are on a project where there are rumble strips, it's highly recommended to have at least 3 feet of clear zone to the right of the rumbles. 4 feet would be ideal. The rumbles should also have longitudinal gaps as well, so that cyclists can occasionally cross over to one side or the other of the rumbles. Okay. One of the last, I think this might be the last suggestion that we have, I want to make you guys aware, is that IDOT has approved this sign. It's a lesser backup. The ideal would be to have nice smooth shoulders without rumble strips or with enough clear zone, or have bike lanes. But if that's just not possible, if you're looking at a popular route with moderate traffic or higher route, where there's a genuinely higher risk of cyclists getting hit by cars, that might be the type of road where you would put this sign up. It's an R4-102 that IDOT approved in the last year or so. And as an organization, we've worked with a bunch of agencies, probably 15 or 20 agencies, to get these installed at some high priority locations around the state. Signal actuation in almost every town where I've done a bike plan, the residents who show up for the meetings, the cyclists who show up, say that I have a hard time triggering the green light when I'm biking on road. And that is an issue. The demand actuated stoplights are hard for bikes to trigger unless they're in a good spot for it. The pedestrian buttons that are provided are generally not accessible for people who are on bike on road. And if you do try to access them, you have to lift your bike over the curb, go over to push the button, come back, get yourself back in the roadway, hopefully not when it turns green. So this is an issue. And if you're the cyclist who's the first one at this intersection, a car that might come behind you will try to be polite and stay pretty far back of you, and no one will trigger the green. So this is a very common problem that is out there, and there are ways to solve it. If you go with different types of signal detectors, of different, like a quadruple loop will work in detecting cyclists more. Video detection tends to be pretty good as well. These are ways where bikes can be detected and a green can be called. But even with the old style of detector, the perimeter of the detector is much more sensitive to bikes, especially the corner. So there's testing that can occur. There's a procedure that can occur where you can see if the bike can trigger it. You may need to tweak the amplifier a little bit, but it is possible to make it, at most locations, it's possible to make it so a bike can trigger a regular detector. Where you find that sweet spot in your testing, there is an MUTCD marking to mark that spot, and it's good for both bikes as well as motorcyclists as well. And there's an accompanying sign, the R10-22, to tell you what to do to trigger the green light. All right, so that's the list of different off-road and on-road types of bikeways. There are other ones that are out there. I tried to hit the main ones and some of the newer ones as well. But there's a lot that's out there. Naktil's done a really good job of following those, so do use that as a resource. The last topic will be, again, just kind of some random bikeway strategy tips, and I'll talk about different grants as well, things that didn't fit into the earlier parts of the presentation. First one I would suggest is that, especially if you're doing a bike plan in a town, is to get local cyclists involved. From their desire to find the safest way across town to their destination, they've developed just a ton of practical local knowledge about what are the conditions, what's a small improvement that could make a big difference, and they're generally very willing to contribute in a constructive way. So many different towns where I've done bike plans, the elected officials would say, man, we haven't had 70 people show up for a positive reason in a long, long time at a city council meeting. So there's desire that's out there. If you as a community or a consultant needs to find local residents, we can help out. We have a membership list with people in many places of the state. So we're glad to help on that. Strava, if you haven't heard of this yet, Strava is a phone app that many cyclists, especially your club level riders, those who are more traffic tolerant, will track where they bike. And Strava will aggregate these bike trips from all of their different users into a single map that is for anywhere in the world. I use this when I'm going to go to like a different country or a different state on vacation to see what are the routes that local cyclists use. But it can be a great tool for your work. Is this a road that is popular for cyclists? You know, is this a side street that is crossing the busy street? Is it a side street that a lot of cyclists use? If it is, maybe I have to focus on that demand actuation issue. Or maybe, as what's seen in this example, we have two quiet side streets and then we have to jog on a busy road for a short stretch. If that's the case, maybe I'll focus on adding shoulders on at least that small jog stretch that cyclists are using. So this is a great tool. It doesn't cover very well the more transportation-based cyclists who bike out of necessity, but it's better than nothing. A low-res version online is available at that URL, and as of a couple months ago, Strava Metro is now providing their detailed data showing times of day, direction, actual counts. They now have that detailed data available for communities and planners and transportation advocates. Great resource. I mentioned already it tends to be more the traffic tolerant cyclists. Not as many of the casual and necessity cyclists are tracking their trips, but it's better than nothing. And Strava does claim that half of the trips that are recorded are transportation related trips by their audience. Another tip, so many different bike plans, once they're completed, have been submarined, have been put on hold because of implementation at one particular location. So watch out for these political landmines, which can really hurt the progress in your town. And a main one is removing parking by businesses. Even removing parking along one of those wide residential collectors, that can just hold things up completely because of the level of opposition. If you do need to remove parking to implement something, do it very carefully, get the buy-in, explain it, look at all the options, and you have to really work the issue. The second one is back to that Geneva example, is widening sidewalks along residential streets to put in a side path, converting a 5-foot sidewalk to a 10-foot side path. Very often on that type of street anyway, a side path might not be that appropriate just because of the number of crossings. But this is, the whole idea of widening a sidewalk in my front yard gets people angry. And then finally, going back to the retrofitting off-road trails near homes without having that Rails to Trails Conservancy research to combat those common fears that almost always seem to come up. Save money by being opportunistic. Obviously you can go out for grants, but if you're going to be repaving a road, it might be a great time to do something cheaper. If you're going to be doing a major development, such as on the left side here, this picture, take a look at connections to that arterial. We have been designing subdivisions that tend to be really kind of restricted in terms of its access, but man, those little connections between subdivisions or to the outside roads are very important for bicycling. Editing a development ordinance to make sure those things become routine is a good step. Complete streets policy is something that is a commitment that your city council can take. It says, when we do a road projects, we're going to accommodate all users, not just cars. If you do have a complete streets policy, then adopting road standards that incorporate this automatically is a good strategy. And when you have the opportunity to have an upcoming road project or an upcoming development, have someone on staff take the time to take a look at, can this be made more bike friendly? A few more slides. This one is a general one on different Bikeway funding. I would suggest that if you have a fairly small scale project, if you're striping a particular road, if you're doing a spot improvement, if it's not a high ticket cost item, it might be better just to do that within your capital improvement program, within the municipal budget. So the cheaper things, it's not really worth going out for that external funding. Developer requirements, Again, if you have things in your development ordinance or road design standards, then you can get developers to build some of these things for free. Bike parking ordinance is something that's out there. A few towns such as Naperville and Champaign have good examples. And then the outside grant funding sources, which the last few slides we'll look at. These tend to be very competitive. They're better for your larger scale project. And as many of you know, if you do get one of those grants, the implementation time could be much longer and the design requirements could be tougher. So a few slides on the different, the major bikeway grant types that are out there. The Transportation Alternatives Program consists of IDOT's Transportation Enhancements Program, as well as programs within the largest MPOs of Illinois. I believe there's 5 of them that offer their own TAP programs. Chicago, Rockford, I want to say Peoria, St. Louis area, I forget the other right now. In these, the MPOs make their own grant decisions. There is a 20% match generally, and it does go through the federal process, so you have the IDOT review and so on. The ITEP program, I'm sure, has been on many people's minds this fall because a grant cycle just came and went. The dollar amount for that program has grown significantly because of the state capital bill that included annual funding for this program. So now we're seeing at least $80 million every 2 years in the combined federal and state money. That state bill did include a provision that if your community is not a wealthy community, if it's a fairly needy community, that you might not even have to pay a local match. That could be waived or partially waived. So it's worth taking a fresh look if you're in one of those communities. The ITEP program is better if you have a larger project. I would suggest 300,000 or more. 2 million is the maximum. That may or may not go up in the future. Historically, 6-to-1 demand versus supply, 8-to-1 or even greater sometimes. It's very competitive. So make sure you have a project that is not going to have problems with right-of-way acquisition, not going to have problems with any of the engineering issues that may come up. I do want to mention that most of the ITEP funding, the bike part of it, has gone to pay for individual trails as well as some bridges, but I've been involved with a couple of different precedents where a town has finished a bike plan and applied for one ITEP grant to do a whole big chunk of their on-road bikeway network at one time. All the striping, all the signage, and so on. Those examples were Palatine and Effingham. But that is a precedent that's out there if you want to also do on-road using ITEP funding. And then finally, my last comment on ITEP is that there's this perception that all the money goes to Chicagoland. That's baloney, absolute baloney. You know, I go to DC every year lobbying for this pot of money, and we sort it out by congressional district. The rural districts get so much more proportionally by population than do Chicagoland and the metro area. So if you're in a more rural or smaller community, you have a lot better chance. It's a lot less competitive than if you're in Chicagoland. Within Chicagoland and within St. Louis, you have the CMAQ pot of money that has done really well over the years in paying for large-scale bikeway projects. It has funded some very large projects, much larger than that 2 million ITEP list, or a $2 million ITEP limit. Key to the CMAQ program is cost per emissions reduced. So if you're in the farther out suburbs of Chicagoland and you have a fairly expensive project, a bridge project or whatever, you're not going to score very well on cost per emissions reduced. Emissions being defined as around a buffer around your project. So keep that in mind when applying for this source. Different other federal sources, the Safe Routes to School program, we'll have another call here fairly soon that IDOT is administering it. That, funding source has been used primarily for sidewalks and crossing issues around schools, K-8 schools, but it also can fund bike-related projects, side paths, trails, and so on. It does have a non-infrastructure component, so if you're at all connected with a community that wants to provide education in some way, The non-infrastructure part, they're not getting enough applications for the money. So, if you have a good project, you'll win. Two other federal grant programs. The Recreational Trails program is often overlooked because it's so small, $1.5 million per year. It's run by IDNR. It's annual, $200,000 max, but the competition level is very low. So if you have a good project there, you may have a 60% chance of winning. And then some places also have surface transportation money that can be flexed for bikeway projects. IDNR has the State Bike Path Grant Program. However, over the last 12 years, it has been on hold because of IDOT's budget problems, probably 9 or 10 of those years. But if it is a year, such as I believe this year, that it does have a program. It is a good program despite the 50-50 cost share. That generally scares people away. But this is a program where the engineering can be done locally. There is no approval by IDNR that has to take place on every step of the process. So locally engineered often will mean a cheaper project, especially for the more simple bike trail segments that you might be designing. So don't overlook this one if there is a program in a particular year. All right, so I went through a lot of material. See how we're doing time-wise. I think I ran a little bit late. I apologize, but thank you for attending, and be glad to take any questions that you might have. And I have to expand this so I can see the questions. I am not currently see the chat yet, so.
I can read it to you, Ed. Thank you so much for the presentation. You covered a lot of ground there. This is a lot for people to take in. We do have a very brief amount of time. Ed, you mentioned that you could maybe answer some other questions if anyone had some remaining ones and they hadn't asked them yet. But we do have one right now from Alex. Alex asks, can adding bike lanes to quote unquote extra wide roads reduce vehicle speeds even if there's little bike traffic drawn to the bike lane? Any experience or studies related that you can reference?
So I can't cite a specific study, but from what I have heard from others that have talked about this issue with me is that it's not directly correlated. The benefit that you gain does not necessarily require a lot of bike traffic on that road. It is the act of narrowing the lanes itself that has a pretty good effect. Obviously, if you have bike traffic there, then it should have an effect. I haven't seen the study, but the act of simply narrowing the actual traffic lanes is a significant portion of it.
All right, it looks like we don't have any other questions, but Ed, you have your contact information up there, and if anyone has any follow-ups or things that pop into their mind later or want to get in touch, they can reach out to you.
Yeah, very good. Again, we're a resource. We're glad to, whether you're doing a road project design and you need to bounce off some ideas or whatever, that's one of our purposes of being here.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for attending. I think it went well. Ed, thank you for being here to present. And then Josh, do you have any final words?
Nope. As you kind of said, if you have any questions, please reach out to Ed, or if you have any questions on PDHs or whatnot, you could reach out to Andrew. Take a look at the annual banquet notifications coming up, and have a great day, guys.
Thanks.
All right, see you everyone.
Later.